Welcome back, everyone, to day 7 and the final class of our How to Read the Bible course. Our last class is titled Tools and Resources, and it's going to be a bit different than our previous days. On today's docket, we will in real time be demonstrating how to use some free online tools and resources that you can go away and use in your study as you exegete for yourself. We will share some recommendable secondary sources, and to round off the class, we will carry out some text studies together. So we will be visiting some websites and demonstrating how to use them. You can open these same sites on your computer, your phone, another device and follow along, or you can take notes and duplicate the steps yourself later on, or you can simply watch, learn, and then revisit this video if need be. So you proceed with this tutorial in a way that works for you. And now let's get right into it. The first resource we recommend, most of you are likely already familiar with, the website called Bible Gateway. This is a free website. It's the text of the entire Bible. And we'll just briefly show a few of its features which you can make use of in your study. So we go to BibleGateway.com. This is the main homepage you'll land on. You can either type in a specific verse or passage you're looking for. So we can type in Luke 8, press enter, and we have before us Luke chapter 8. If we go back to the homepage, you'll also see here is a drop-down menu of the books of the Bible. If you want to go directly to a book, say Ruth. Next, over here in this menu, you'll find a list of almost every English Bible version in circulation, as well as a few in other languages too, including Arabic, Bulgarian, Spanish, Cherokee, Japanese, and so on. This is a useful feature because you now have the Bible versions all in one place, and you can also compare versions side by side. So if we again type in Luke 8 and we leave the version on in the NIV, and then say you want to compare Luke 8 in the NIV to Luke 8 in the complete Jewish Bible version, you just click here on the icon that looks like two documents, Add Parallel, change the parallel version to the CJB, and there you have it, side by side. And you can do this again and add a third parallel text for comparison and a fourth, and so on. To close any parallel text, just click the X in the corner. Another useful feature on BibleGateway.com is that you can change the font size. Up here in the right-hand corner, click on Font Size and change it to what suits your needs. You can also use a highlighter. So just highlight a block of text with your cursor, and then you'll be given these options of colors you can use as needed. The colors won't save unless you have an account, which you can sign up completely for free, but they'll apply as long as you're on the page, and it can be useful for easing the eye as you study. Now, if you go over to this menu and you click the setting icon where it says page options, you can decide what text features you'd like to see appear in the text below. So you can click cross-references. And as you can see, the cross-references appear below. End of verse 1, proclaiming to the good news of the kingdom of God. And then you see a B here. Click the B and it will let you know the cross-reference. Similarly, you can include or exclude the verse numbers, include or exclude the headings. You can choose to apply the red letter setting, which highlights in red whenever God is speaking in the text. And there you have it, a straightforward online resource to study the Bible online. The second online resource we strongly recommend that you use is a website called BibleHub.com. It is in some ways similar to Bible Gateway. It contains the full biblical text, but it holds a treasure trove of additional tools that we will now explore. Here we have the homepage. At the very top of the page, where it says Gen, we have a drop-down menu of the books in the Bible. You can search for a specific text, chapter, and verse, and also the various Bible translations. In this search bar just below, you can search for, again, a specific text or even a keyword. If you want to look up goats in the Bible, you can type in goat. Let's do that now. And it will show you, in the order it appears in the Bible, all the instances goat shows up in the text. Back to the home page. Let's again look at Luke 8. And up here you can choose from versions. Let's pick NIV for now. Here we have Luke 8 from the NIV. Now, depending on the chapter, you'll sometimes find on the left-hand column maps of the region being mentioned in the text. You can click on the map and you're taken to this encyclopedia of facts about this location. So let's click on Galilee. And we're showed the etymology of the location name, references to this place in other Bible texts, and some general facts about this location, which can sometimes prove useful or in the least interesting. Okay, let's go back to Luke 8. When you are looking at specific verses, if you see this menu bar up here at the top of the page, you can use this tool up here called Parallel. Let's click on that. Luke 8, verse 1. On the left side, we have the verse in major English Bible versions. You can make comparisons between them. On the right side, if we scroll down a bit, it says cross-references. You can see this same event, for example, being mentioned in the other Gospels. And further down the page, we have Treasury of Scripture. These are similar Bible texts that may reflect the same theme or keywords as you find in Luke 8:1. Scrolling back up to the top of the page, coming back to this menu, first it says sermons, audio, and visuals. Now that may seem exciting, but it really isn't. I hope one thing we firmly established in this class is that there are a lot of poor exegetes out there, and thus a lot of poor sermons too. So I recommend ignoring these three titles. See here where it says comment. This stands for commentaries. Again, a word of caution here. Not all Bible commentaries are born equal. There are many lousy commentaries out there and many that are mixed bags. So as responsible exegetors, we are not going to primarily depend on these commentaries. And this website doesn't include the best ones. So it's best to skip past them as this is not a recommendable feature on this website in the main. But, and here is where Bible Hub absolutely shines. Next to the commentary feature, you can see it says interlin, which stands for interlinear. Let's click on that. What you see here is Luke 8:1, and we're shown the original language alongside the English. So for now, ignore the little numbers on top, but let's look at the first word. It says kai. This is the phonetic version of the Greek word. It's anglicized. This is how it's pronounced. Kai. Beneath it, you see how the word kai is written in Koine Greek, which we remember is the language the New Testament was written in. And then below it, we see the English translation, and. The little word beneath and is shortened as conj. If we hover over it with our cursor, we see it stands for conjunction. This is a grammar term. You'll find each of the words in this verse have these little grammar terms beneath them, and it's telling us what kind of word it is in grammatical terms. So if we go a couple of words over to the right, soon is an adverb. He is this wonderful jumble of letters, PPRONM3S. Now, these terms are meaningless unless you're already a big grammar buff and understand grammatical terms, or if you Google them to make more sense of them. Okay, so say you wish to explore a specific word in this sentence in the original language. You click on the kai in blue, which takes you to this page. Here you see some other occurrences of kai in the Bible, Matthew 1:2, Matthew 1:3, Matthew 1:11, and so on. Then over here, on the right-hand side, where it says Strong's Greek at the very top, we can click on there. Strong's Concordance is a well-known Hebrew and Greek lexicon. And what you want to be focusing on here is this little first box in the top left-hand corner under the title Strong's Concordance. Here we are given a little info summary about this word, kai, meaning and, even, also. You get the phonetic version or transliteration as it's also called. And here it's also sometimes used to mean and, even, also, and namely. If you scroll down, you'll find other lexicons as well, which you can also refer to and research. These lexicons may explain the word in deeper detail or different detail. For example, Help's Word Studies, which is another Greek lexicon, informs us that kai is the most common New Testament conjunction, that it can mean and, also, very often, moreover, even, and indeed. The context determines the exact sense. Then we're told kai is never adversative. It never means however or but, unlike the principal conjunction, which is wow in Old Testament Hebrew. All this informs us about how to translate the text, which can be very helpful. But again, when using this function, it suffices often to just focus on this little left-hand corner box under Strong's Concordance for the information you need. Now let's go back to the interlinear view. Luke 8 begins with kai egeneto en to kathexes. Now we can see the translation choice that the translators of the NIV have made regarding the word kai. As we know, even in English, a word can mean several things and have several uses. We saw that kai can mean and, also, very often, even, indeed. And as with all translation work, you have to make a decision. And this decision, of course, ought to be heavily influenced, if not entirely determined, by the context. The context here seems to comfortably allow for kai to be translated as and it came to pass. Now please note, if a passage or chapter begins with a word or phrase such as but or therefore or and then, we must pay attention to this. Because when was the last time you went up to your friend and began a conversation with the words, and then? Beginning like this suggests a continuation of something. What you're saying is somehow connected to what's come before it. So we must ask ourselves, what's come before Luke 8:1? Well, Luke chapter 7. The end of Luke 7, beginning from verse 36, we find this story of a sinful woman approaching Jesus and anointing him with expensive oil. She does this in the house of the Pharisee named Simon, who is hosting a dinner Jesus is attending. Simon criticizes Jesus for allowing himself to be touched by a woman with a reputation of being a sinner. But Jesus shows her compassion, forgives her, and sends her on her way in peace and with dignity. So that's what's come before. Now, knowing this, how will that context shed light on what's about to happen in Luke 8? These are the questions we need to be asking. A tiny word like and or but are important. Now, sometimes you will find in your exegeting that you disagree with the translation choice. That is okay. Look into it. Make informed, contextually informed decisions on your translation choices. Let's look at another Greek word in Luke 8:1. Over here, almost towards the end of the first line, we have the word pollen, translated as city. Click on the blue word pollen. We come to our concordance as before, we click on Strong's Greek, and again on the left hand we have information about our word and its root. It tells us that the root word of pollen is police, meaning a city, or is also used to mean inhabitants of a city, where we get the word in English metropolis. Scroll down, you find more information about the grammar and usage of this word. Back to Luke 8:1. Here at the top, you can see the blue back and forth arrows to go to the next or the previous verse. Let's go to verse 2, for example, and back again. Something you may have noticed is that the words as they appear in the original language seem all scrambled. And that's because words don't always appear in the same order in a sentence in different languages. And Greek is one of those that can be hilariously jumbled up if we were to read the literal order in English. A little example of this, beginning of verse 2, and women certain who had been cured from spirits evil. So we wouldn't leave the words like this in a translation. We'd order them so they make more sense in English. We'd order them in and certain women who had been cured from evil spirits. There are other tools in Bible Hub, but the interlineary tool is the main one that we recommend using. It can massively deepen and help you in your exegesis of texts. As much as it would be wonderful for everyone, in the blink of an eye, to learn ancient Hebrew and Koine Greek, the reality is that many don't have the time or the means to make that happen. By all means, if you do like to study languages, please do. But if it's not an option for you, using the interlineary tool in Bible Hub can be a huge help in bridging the gap between the original languages and you. It allows you to look closely at the meanings of words, translation choices that others have made, the grammatical makeup, parsing words and phrases, and to easily and quickly get an overview of what a text says in the original language, without needing to be fluent in Greek or Hebrew. We strongly urge you to use this tool when exegeting and not to take for granted the English translations you may have. Translators are biased because they're human beings. And as we've seen, translators can have agendas, be lazy, or just repeat others' mistakes. So look at the Hebrew, look at the Greek. The interlineary tool in Bible Hub is a powerhouse of a tool and completely free to use. A third tool which you can use if you're interested is a software program called Logos, Logos Bible Software. This is a program which functions very similarly to what we saw in Bible Hub, with interlineary text, grammatical breakdown, commentaries, lexicons, and so on. Except it goes into greater detail at times and is available offline. But Logos is not free. So Bible Hub is an excellent free version that contains many of the same features. On the other hand, if you are looking to invest money in a software, then Logos is highly recommendable. Logos is a program used at university level for theology students and Bible researchers, and it comes with some perks here and there, such as a free electronic book of the month, which you can download, ranging from theology books to commentaries. And there are some other perks as well. So Logos is an option if you want to spend money on that. Another free online research you may find useful is called gntreader.com. This is a website with a very simple layout, user-friendly. It is good for you if you want a deep dive into the grammar of words in the text. Again, similar to what Bible Hub does, just formatted a little differently. So let's go visit gntreader.com. Here we have it, and let's again go to Luke 8. And on GNT Reader, we don't have the English text, only the Greek. So if you don't know Koine Greek, this would be good to use alongside Bible Hub, where you can see the English interlineary text. Verse 1, here is our familiar word, kai. If you go ahead and click on kai, on the right-hand side, you'll see a column that shows an in-depth grammatical breakdown of this word. Go to the next word, egeneto. It says this word is a verb. It is an aorist middle indicative third person singular form. This website is great if you already know a fair amount about grammar, or if you're learning Koine Greek and you're practicing parsing. Parsing, morphology, that sort of thing. If you're not familiar with these things, this website may be a bit heavy and not relevant for your use. And the point is, of course, to make exegeting accessible. So if you feel like it's jargon, you can go ahead and ignore this resource. A useful tool and worth mentioning, but just not for everyone. And that's more than okay. You use the tools which you can actually make use of. Okay, let's close this window down and touch a bit on Bible commentaries. If you're looking for a good commentary series, we can recommend three really good choices. The first is called Hermeneia. This obnoxiously colored series we see here, printed by Augsburg Fortress Press. There are hundreds and thousands of Bible commentary series out there, and many of them fall short in quality and also in methodological consistency. But in biblical studies, there are few series singled out more by scholars for its consistently stellar contribution to the field as Hermeneia is. The introduction note reads, "The editors of Hermeneia impose no systematic theological perspective upon the series. It is expected that the authors will struggle to lay bare the ancient meaning of a biblical work or pericope." Meaning, those who have worked on translation and exposition haven't been forced into a narrow theological view by the editors, but have been allowed to go where the text may lead. That should already make us fall a little bit in love with this series. If you were to purchase the entire Hermeneia series in hard print, you'd pay nearly 4,000 US dollars. But when you have logos, you can purchase the electronic logos edition and you'll save thousands compared to the print price. Plus, it takes up less space. Some of you may have this series in your local library, and if so, I recommend using it. It's sadly not free to own yourself, but as we said, if you do go ahead and get logos, the price is dramatically slashed. The second series recommendation we can mention is the Expositor's Bible Commentary. This is a pretty decent series that has some fairly solid exposition throughout. Often, especially preachers, enjoy using this one because it is easy to use when you're not necessarily looking for the deepest academic content, but something user-friendly and approachable. And finally, one of my personal favorites and a very good Bible commentary series. The Word series has some excellent overall work. It is judicious, insightful, and often well balanced in its analysis. A highly recommended series. A few things to keep in mind when you are consulting whatever commentary you are consulting. First, please do not assume that just because the commentary is older, that it is more accurate or true to the text. In fact, this is rarely the case. Secondly, at the beginning pages of your commentary series, you will usually find an editor's note or an introduction section. And in this section, the editors will state their chosen methodology. They may use terms such as historical critical, for example. It can help to be aware of the methods the editors and translators have used, if any. For example, one commentary series may state that it has based a lot of its work on the foundation of others' previous translation work. For example, our translation is built on the foundation of the King James Version, which means that it will likely adopt many of the errors and biases which come with the KJV. So read the editor's note or introduction. It will tell you about their branch of theology, how it will affect their method, and so on. If you want a little overview of some of the other pretty good commentary series, you can check out this website, an article called 7 of the Best Exegetical Bible Commentaries, an article by Logos. It gives a brief review of each, their strengths and weaknesses, and mentions the methodology of the editors. But please, as always, look first to the primary source, to the biblical text, and exegete that first before consulting any commentaries. It is so easy to get into the habit of depending completely on others' commentary of the text, but that defeats the purpose of what we're learning in this course. and it often leads to Bible readers just repeating each other's mistakes for decades, for centuries even. So, Bible first, secondary sources last. Now, let's talk a bit about languages. If you do decide you'd like to learn the biblical languages, here are some of the best tools which you'll need. If you're learning Koine Greek, we recommend this textbook, The Elements of New Testament Greek by Jeremy Duff. This is an excellent textbook which takes you from the very basics, the alphabet, to vocabulary and into the grammar. Easy to follow, straightforward, and a best-selling book from Cambridge. This was the textbook I used at university when learning Koine Greek. There are also other books and resources as part of Duff's Greek series, for example, vocabulary card sets and listening material. But again, the book is really the one that you'll need. The second book you'll need is called Novum Testamentum Graece, which looks like this, otherwise known as the Nestle Aland edition. This book is the Koine Greek text of the New Testament. It's like your Greek New Testament Bible. It is an edition called the Critical Edition, which has to do with how it's drawing from various ancient manuscripts out there and determining which is closest to the original. So as you're studying the language, you'll learn the language from the textbook by Duff, and then begin reading and studying the Novum Testamentum Graece New Testament. These are the books that first-year university theology students use and read from. You can often find second-hand or used versions online that will make it a pretty cheap purchase. Now, if you're learning Greek at home, and you're a person who feels they could benefit from, in addition to going through the textbook yourself, having some form of lecture or teacher just to nudge you along the way, there is a link in the resources list for this course. This link is for a playlist to a Koine Greek teacher on YouTube who has done a great job at going through Duff's textbook. Mind you, he doesn't teach you Greek or cover everything in the book, so you'll have to go through that yourself, and the book does a great job at guiding you. But he explains some things, highlights some important aspects of every lesson in the textbook, and can help you have some anchor in the process of teaching yourself. So recommendable to watch. And lastly, a big part of learning a language is learning vocabulary. It's what you'll spend a lot of your time doing, and some find it very useful in this process to have flashcards. There are some different card sets out there that you can pick from. For example, this Basics of Biblical Greek Vocabulary cards by William D. Mounce. There are also some phone apps out there, for example, the Greek for All vocabulary app, linked in the resources list. If you fancy having it on your phone, or you can just do what I did at university and make your own, buying a card set is not something you have to do. Before I move into the Hebrew resources, this may seem a bit obvious to say at this point, but just so it's said, please be aware that there are different types of Greek and Hebrew. Just like Old English is not modern English. So if you're going to learn biblical Greek, it has to be what is called Koine Greek. And if you're learning Hebrew, it has to be biblical ancient Hebrew. Trying to learn Hebrew in Duolingo, for example, would not really work for this purposes, as you learn modern Hebrew there. So that's your basics if you want to learn Koine Greek. Now, in the case of Hebrew, we recommend The Basics of Biblical Hebrew by Gary Pratico and Miles Van Pelt. This is actually a series. In this series pack, you get a book on grammar, a 36-part video lectures, a workbook, a set of 100 vocabulary flashcards, vocabulary audio, so teaching you pronunciation, and a laminated sheet containing a shortcut to basics that you need to learn. This is an excellent pack. Great if you're learning the language on your own. And again, this is the resources pack used by first-year university students. It's clear, high quality, and comprehensive. Again, you'll find a link to these in the resources list. If you do want to save money, there are plenty of students out there who sell these books secondhand on places like eBay, where you can get them for a much cheaper price. So, that's if after this course you feel like you want to learn Greek and or Hebrew. Now, this option of learning the biblical languages isn't for everyone. It isn't a feasible or affordable or possible option for all. And I would like to stress that this is more than okay. You don't have to learn Greek and Hebrew in order to begin exegeting. You don't have to be an expert in these languages to begin improving your studying of the Bible. After all, the point of this course is to make sure these tools and information aren't out of reach for people who can't afford university. All this to say that it's up to you. If you cannot learn Greek and Hebrew, that's okay. As we've seen, for example, with Bible Hub, there are plenty of tools that can help you compensate for that. Let's move on to another resource. This one is specifically for those who are university students. If you attend a university, particularly in the UK, you may have access to an EBSCO account. If you have an account, this means you'll be able to sign in and access the online ebooks and e-journals at the Roy Graham Library. The Roy Graham Library is an on-campus library of Newbold College in England. They have a decent collection of excellent theological books and journals from all over the world. You can read some of these online if you have an EBSCO account. Of course, if you can visit the library in person, please do. It's worth exploring, particularly the upstairs, the north wing, so you turn to your right at the stairs. And last but not least, we have two final resources we can recommend, two books. The first is called The Drama of Scripture by Craig Bartholomew and Michael Goheen. This is a book we've referenced before here at Zeteo, both in this course and in our Covenant Theology course. The drama of Scripture is an engaging way of being introduced to the methodology of biblical theology. It looks at the Bible as one unified narrative and returns the reader to view the text as a story that we are a part of and have a place in. Great book, easy to read, really useful, and a great gift to give to others if you'd like them to be introduced to this methodology. The second book we can mention here is called How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth by Gordon Fee. This book covers a lot of what we've done in this class, but goes into further detail into topics like literary analysis, another really good book. And that's it for the resources we'll mention today. There are obviously many more great books and tools out there. We can't mention them all here. We do, again, state in the strongest terms, not all books about the Bible are helpful, informed, or qualified in their guidance. What we have a tendency to do is to seek out the voices that reflect our comfort zone or what is familiar to us and what we already know. But if what is familiar to us is irresponsible, albeit common, theological malpractice, then we don't grow or move towards a better place. So be aware of method, be aware of personal and cultural bias, and context is always king. For the remainder of our final class together, we are going to have some fun and carry out a few text studies. We will do this to practice using the exegetical tools we've learned and to demonstrate how powerful sound exegesis can be. Following our text studies, we will round off with a few concluding thoughts to close our course. First, we go to Genesis chapter 38. This story contains a trigger warning. It contains mention of prostitution and spousal death. If you'd like to skip this part, you'll find a timestamp in the description below where you can rejoin us. Okay, Genesis 38. We begin reading verses 1 to 11. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and settled near a certain Adullamite whose name was Hirah. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He married her and went into her. She conceived and bore a son, and he named him Er. Again she conceived and bore a son, whom she named Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she named him Shelah. She was in Chezib when she bore him. Judah took a wife for Er, his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. But Er, Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her. Raise up offspring for your brother." But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled his semen on the ground whenever he went into his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. What he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up," for he feared that he too would die like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. Our story begins with Judah, who is one of the sons of Jacob. Judah marries a Canaanite woman and has 3 sons with her, Er, Onan, and Shelah. Judah's sons grow up. Judah picks a wife for his firstborn son, Er. Her name is Tamar, but Er dies. And so Judah instructs his other son, the second in line, Onan, to perform the duty of a brother-in-law. It is both apparent from the text and from historical context that this means having sexual intercourse with Tamar so that she may bear a son. However, Onan is described as spilling his semen on the ground instead, meaning he doesn't ejaculate inside Tamar, but uses what we might call the pull-out method. And we're told that this displeases God. A lot to unpack here, and at every level, we as Western readers are perhaps left with a sense of absurdity, even perversion at how this all plays out. Asking a brother-in-law to inseminate his widowed sister-in-law, what on earth? Now, the story of Onan and his actions have left a rather distinct mark on some Christian teaching, tradition, and even language today. First of all, for centuries, many priests would instruct male members of their churches with the phrase, "It is better to cast your seed in the belly of a whore than spill it on the ground." This stemmed from the belief that the meaning of the story of Onan was that male semen is so precious that adultery or soliciting prostitutes was a lesser sin than spilling one's seed, so to speak, the lesser of two evils. For a long time, Western society believed that the entire key to conception and life lay with the male, specifically in his semen, and that women were simply the vessel in which a child was carried. Therefore, men's semen was equated with life. And this is not some ancient bygone idea either. We still see remnants of this thinking in the teachings of the Catholic Church, in which semen is viewed as sacred, and masturbation and the use of contraception is considered a sin and is forbidden. Let us now highlight 2 disasters among many which have sprung from this teaching. First of all, this verse has historically been used to justify fornication or adultery. Men have, as we said, with the support of their clergy, visited town prostitutes or had sex outside their marriage, all seemingly backed by the Bible. Secondly, the Catholic teachings against the use of contraception, including the use of condoms, have led to a number of crises and human suffering. As a continuation of a long tradition, in July 1968, Pope Paul VI issued an official letter called Humanae Vitae, meaning of human life. In it, he restated the Church's staunch opposition to contraception. One of the impacts of such teaching has been the unstemmed spread of the HIV virus and the AIDS epidemic. It has been found that countries struggling with high HIV rates will often have a high or predominant Catholic population. For example, in Kenya, it is the Christian women and men who have the higher infection rate in comparison with their Muslim counterparts. Despite how AIDS has ravaged whole countries, the Catholic Church continues to hold fast to their teachings of no contraceptives and instructs parents to avoid letting their children be taught safe sex methods, that abstinence is the only option aside from marital sex. This leads to a lack of sexual and health education and the continued spread of HIV and other sexually transmitted diseases, which cause everything from infertility to cancer to death. Another impact this teaching has had concerns financial unsustainability in Catholic families stricken by poverty. Many Catholic married couples, due to the lack of contraceptive options, often end up with many children. This is a problem if you cannot financially support or feed these children. In the city of Manila, many of the Filipino maternity wards are so full that new mothers have to share one bed with two other patients. But in the deeply Catholic Philippines, church leaders still hold sway over politics. A former Filipino senator, Manny Pacquiao, stated, "God said go forth and multiply. He did not say go and have just one or two children." A previous president of the Philippines has been threatened with excommunication from the Catholic Church for his support of a bill which would make contraceptives more available. And all the while, the uncontrollable population growth leads to food shortage, starvation, and a compromised ecosystem. A similar thing happened in Ireland, particularly during periods of famine or food shortage, where poorer Catholic families would experience inescapable generational poverty and even starvation, being unable to feed or sustain a large family. And yet they could not, according to the Catholic Church, use contraceptives. Beyond this, the health and welfare of working class women, those who were least likely to have access to contraception, often suffered greatly as a result of multiple births. And this isn't even beginning to mention issues such as a lack of respect for the autonomy of women's bodies, the high death rate of mothers with pre-existing health complications, high-risk pregnancies, or the removal of choice. Once again, we see the interpretation of biblical texts having massive real-life repercussions. A common interpretation of the story of Onan is that God struck him down because he wasted his seed. But let us have a second look at Genesis 38. In the previous chapter, we have the story of Judah and his brothers selling off their brother Joseph into slavery in Egypt. And while Joseph is in Egypt, it's as though the story goes, in the meantime, this is how life continued back home. The years roll on, Judah has 3 sons, his eldest dies, and then this whole situation happens. In order to understand this story, we must understand the cultural and historical realities and customs of the time. First of all, fertility and the bearing of children was seen as a woman's rite of passage in society to having a place, status, respectability, but also financial and future stability. A woman's survival in this society depended on her connection and ties to men, whether it was her father, her husband, or her son. A woman would move from being provided for under her father's house and then later her husband's. This was the only honorable way for her to have a roof over her head, food, and protection. We must stress in the strongest terms here that this was not God implemented or a God willed reality, but it was how the current culture worked. And this is why there existed this custom where if the wife of one man becomes a widow, it was considered the obligation, the responsibility of one of the dead man's brothers to have sex with the widow until she was provided with an heir. This would give the widow access to the inheritance which would have been given to her dead husband. She couldn't, as a woman, have access to that inheritance on her own, but she could if she was the mother of a son who would receive that inheritance in his father's stead. Secondly, we must also keep in mind that the greatest amount of inheritance went to the eldest son of the family. The second largest portion went to the second eldest, and so on down the line. Now, with this in mind, we can better understand what's happening here. Judah tells his second eldest son Onan to carry out his duty and give Tamar a son. But Onan instead spills his semen onto the ground. Why? Well, verse 9 tells us his reason. But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled his semen on the ground whenever he went into his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. Onan's choice has to do with inheritance. If Tamar, his older brother's widow, bears a son, then she gains access to the largest portion of the inheritance. But if Tamar does not bear a son, then Onan becomes the next in line. He becomes the receiver of the largest portion of the inheritance. Onan doesn't want to lose that to an offspring which would be viewed in their society as being the son of heir, even though the child would biologically be Onan's. So if we begin to see now, Onan, through his actions, is stealing Tamar's future survival. He is deliberately depriving a widow of her access to support and a living. He's keeping her from being a protected or respected person in society because Onan wants the lion's share of his father's inheritance. Now, this theme in the story is further highlighted if we see how it continues. Let's keep reading. Verse 11. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up," for he feared that he too would die like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. Judah promises his daughter-in-law that she may bear a son by Judah's third and youngest son, Shelah, who is not yet grown up. He says, "Stay in your father's house, Tamar, until Shelah can perform his duty and give you a son. And then you will have access to the inheritance rights that you are due." But we're told he does this because he fears that Shelah will die too. Judah seems to be hoping that nothing comes of this, that Shelah does not have to give Tamar a son. In course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah's time of mourning was over, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep," she put off her widow's garments, put on a veil, wrapped herself up, and sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. She saw that Shelah was grown up, yet she had not been given to him in marriage. So Judah is passing through the area where Tamar lives. She hears that he's coming. And what does she do? She takes off her widow's garments, the clothes one wears when in mourning, and dresses up specifically with a veil. Why does she do this? Well, it tells us of her expectations. She thinks Judah is coming there to finally introduce Shelah to Tamar, so that Tamar and Shelah can be married as promised. She wears a veil because this was custom of how a new bride would be introduced to her husband on their wedding day before consummating the marriage. And so her taking off her widow's clothes and putting on a veil tells us what she thinks is about to happen. But what does actually happen is that she sees Shelah, that he is grown up now, but that Judah has not kept his promise and doesn't seem to intend to keep his promise to give Shelah to Tamar in marriage. Verse 15. When Judah saw her, he thought her to be a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He went over to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come into you." for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me that you may come in to me?" He answered, "I will send you a kid from the flock." And she said, "Only if you give me a pledge until you send it." He said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, "Your signet and your cord and the staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went in to her, and she conceived by him. Then she got up and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of her widowhood. Upon arriving, Judah sees Tamar and mistakes her for a prostitute. Imagine that. She's standing there, broken-hearted and in shock. And now she's mistaken for a prostitute. Not only that, but her own father-in-law doesn't recognize her and says he wishes to solicit her immediately, promising that he will later pay her with one of the lambs from his flock. Now, Tamar has already had some experience with Judah not doing things he's promised to do. So she says, "I need some down payment, some promise now that you will pay me later, a pledge." And she asks for some of the items he has on him. Judah agrees, they do the deed, she leaves and puts her widow garments back on. Verse 20. When Judah sent the kid by his friend the Adullamite to recover the pledge from the woman, he could not find her. He asked the townspeople, "Where is the prostitute who was at Enaim by the wayside?" But they said, "No prostitute has been here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I have not found her." Moreover, the townspeople said, "No prostitute has been here." Judah replied, "Let her keep the things as her own, otherwise we will be laughed at. You see, I sent this kid and you could not find her." Judah tries to get back his belongings and sends the lamb which he promised to pay Tamar with. When no one knows about this prostitute, he's embarrassed and says, "Let her keep the things, otherwise we'll be laughed at." Verse 24. About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has prostituted herself. Moreover, she is pregnant as a result of prostitution." And Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, "It was the owner of these who made me pregnant." And she said, "Take note, please, whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff." Then Judah acknowledged them and said, "She is more in the right than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not lie with her again. When the time of her delivery came, there were twins in her womb." So, Judah solicits what he thinks is a prostitute, but then when he receives word that his daughter-in-law Tamar is pregnant through prostitution, what does he say? "Bring her out and let her be burned." The utter audacity, the double standards here is astounding. And this goes way beyond hypocrisy or pointing the finger. The very fate of widowed women who were not appropriately cared for was often a life of prostitution. As is the reality today, prostitution is not the dream or the first choice of any woman. It comes from societal rejection, poverty, and desperation. A last resort, the final choice of those who have no other choice, suffering the disgrace and exploitation of a male-dominated society. This passage in Genesis 38 is not about masturbation. This passage is not about contraception, nor is it about how semen is magically sacred, nor is it a lesson against contraceptive measures. It's a story about the criminal neglect of a vulnerable widow. If you read the rest of the Old Testament, you will find God speaking extensively about the cause of widows and orphans in society. Widows and orphans. These were the vulnerable people in society, those trapped in poverty, seen as lesser than, without protection, rights, power, or belonging. The pulse of the spiritual state of God's people was measured by how they treated widows and orphans, the poor and the marginalized. The story of Tamar is the story of a widow, In fact, it's the first mention in the Bible of the word widow. She is a widow who is failed by the choices of Onan and of Judah, by two men who refuse to take responsibility or care for this woman's survival through honorable means. Onan, in essence, treated her as a prostitute. He had sex with her under false pretenses. Judah literally treated her as a prostitute and called for her to be punished as one. And who do you think outed Tamar's pregnancy and called her a prostitute to begin with? Well, it would be her father or someone living in her father's house. They would have found out about the pregnancy and made the accusation which they knew would lead to her execution. Either way, the fate of Tamar when her father eventually died would be to receive no support or inheritance because she was a woman, meaning she would likely have to become a prostitute in order to survive. Genesis 38 condemns the men who exploit vulnerable women, who see themselves as blameless as they exploit them, submitting women to patriarchal societal rules, while all the while pointing the accusing finger, ignoring the direct pipeline that runs from being a neglected, vulnerable woman in society to becoming a prostitute who is then blamed and shamed for her life situation, condemned for being so-called corrupt, lustful, or lewd. And yet the only person who is a blameless, vulnerable victim in this entire narrative is Tamar. But she is the only one condemned by other people. Now, we might read this story and focus on our discomfort with how God seems harsh in his punishment of Onan. But that is until we begin to understand the deep evil that Onan and these men carried out. He was willingly weaving a situation where a woman would have to be making the choice between being raped or starving to death for the rest of her life. No, instead, this story should highlight to us in bright colors how deeply God condemns the sexual and financial exploitation of vulnerable women, and how seriously he took their protection, even within the imperfect patriarchal confines of ancient Near Eastern culture. And yet, even though this is what the story is about, Christian tradition and history has twisted it into being about something else. If you go onto Google now and you search for the word onanie, you'll get a Wikipedia hit that says, from German, onanie, masturbation, from the biblical figure Onan. In Norwegian and other Germanic languages, onanie is the word or synonym for masturbation, all having their root in the Bible character called Onan. And so a story about how seriously God takes the exploitation of women in society becomes redirected to instead be about everything from masturbation to contraception to sacred semen, all the while entirely missing the point of the story. And by missing the point of the story, historically causing suffering for thousands, adding to the spread of AIDS, starvation, poverty, engendering shame, poor sex education, and neglecting women's basic rights to bodily autonomy. Exegesis is no small matter. And please, just so misinformation is not further spread here, the pull-out method does not work as an effective form of birth control, whatever your pastor or clergy may claim. Let's now have a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back for another text study. Welcome back, everyone. We continue where we left off. Let's go into our second text study. This will be a shorter one, but still a very good demonstration. Now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. And Saul's servant said to him, "See now, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you." Let our Lord now command the servants who attend you to look for someone who is skillful in playing the lyre. And when the evil spirit from God is upon you, he will play it, and you will feel better. So Saul said to his servants, "Provide for me someone who can play well, and bring him to me." One of the young men answered, "I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a man of valor, a warrior, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence, and the Lord is with him." So Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me your son David, who is with the sheep." Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, a skin of wine, and a kid, and sent them by his son David to Saul. And David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor-bearer. Saul sent to Jesse, saying, "Let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight." And whenever the evil spirit from God was upon Saul, David took the lyre and played it with his hand. And Saul would be relieved and feel better, and the evil spirit would depart from him. So here we have another one of those texts in the Bible that can leave us scratching our heads. There is mention here of an evil spirit from the Lord, which is tormenting King Saul. This is mentioned in verse 14. This is how the king's ailment is described by his servants in verses 15, repeated in verse 16, and again twice in verse 23. Now David, who was anointed to be the next king after Saul, in just the verses before verse 14, is brought in to soothe Saul by playing music. It seems to have a good effect, and Saul asks David to stay on in this capacity. Later on, in chapter 18, while David is playing and singing for Saul, we are told again, the next day an evil spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul threw the spear, for he thought, "I will pin David to the wall." But David eluded him twice. And again in chapter 19, then an evil spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he sat in his house with his spear in his hand while David was playing music. Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear, but he eluded Saul so that he stuck the spear into the wall. David fled and escaped that night. Here we have a repeated description of an evil spirit from the Lord tormenting Saul. How can it be possible, we ask, that an evil spirit which is tormenting a human being can come from God or be sent from God? Is not God good? Does he torment people? Is it his will to cause suffering? How can an evil spirit, who is an enemy of the Lord, come from the Lord? To understand this, we must remind ourselves of something we learned on day 4 of this course, when we were looking at Hebrew narrative and the world of the Old Testament, specifically the concept of divine responsibility. Let us refresh our memories. In the modern West, we think of things in terms of degrees of responsibility, more responsible or less responsible. And we often come at Bible stories asking, is God responsible for that or is he not? Now, this is where we have to try to enter a different world, because unlike us, the Hebrews thought of God's involvement in the world along these lines. Question, is there only one God? Answer, yes. Since there is only one God, and he is Lord of all, then ultimate responsibility rests with him. Even if something was not his will, and he didn't directly do it, the final responsibility rests with him because there is only one God. Now, we try to nuance that more in our present culture, but the Hebrew mindset places God more in the center of his involvement in the affairs of the world than is normally the case in most Western Christian minds today. Here we have an example of the Hebrew mindset, the divine responsibility idea. James wrote that God doesn't tempt anyone. Let no one say when he is tempted, "I am being tempted by God," For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. And he goes on to write from verse 17, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. David wrote in the Psalms, you are not a God who takes pleasure in wickedness. No evil dwells with you. Psalm 5:4. The rest of the biblical narrative negates the idea that evil can come from God or be his will or his doing. We must look to the greater context to understand. The evil spirit did not come to Saul from God, as in God sent it, nor was it in God's will to torment or tempt Saul. But the language here demonstrates a good example of the Hebrew divine responsibility mindset. Our next study is a good demonstration of how looking at the original language and the translation of those words can change the meaning, even sometimes, of well-known texts. We turn to Romans chapter 8. Verse 28 is a verse commonly quoted, much used, deeply familiar to those who've perhaps read the Bible growing up, and it is quoted as saying, all things work together for good to them that love God, or all things work together for those who love God, depending on your version. This is a text many cling to when things go wrong, a kind of spiritual version of every cloud has a silver lining. Sometimes fellow Christians remind each other of this verse as a way of offering consolation that things will all work out in the end. Except this isn't what Paul wrote. We quoted the King James Version earlier, and the KJV's translation made it sound as though everything, all events in the world, have a kind of inner dynamic which would guarantee a happy outcome. But let's pop over to Bible Hub and look at the original language. Romans 8:28, we go to the interlinear text. We know now that to those loving God, all things works together. This Greek verb for works together, synergai, let's have a closer look at that. Click on Strong's Greek. From the root word synergeo, to work together, cooperate with, work together. The verb Paul used doesn't mean works together for, as is translated in the King James. It means works with. So first of all, Paul is saying that it's God who works all things together for good, not that all things are doing it under their own control or are just naturally inclined to be good or work out. This immediately disqualifies an outlook on life that is merely optimistic. Paul is not talking about optimism or that things in the universe have a way of just working themselves out. They don't. It's God's active involvement that is making things work out well or good in the end. And secondly, by looking at this word synerge, where we get the English word synergy from, Paul is explaining how God does this. He does it in collaboration with certain people, alongside people, those who love God. A topic of Romans 8 has to do with vocation. God invites people, all people, to share in what he's already doing. Now, in Romans 8, we get the fuller picture of Paul's idea, and he explains how this works in practice. God knows that the present creation is groaning together like a woman going into labor. These labor pains are the birth pangs of God's new creation. And people who have been grasped by the gospel story, people who are led by the Spirit, are called to share in that groaning, in prayers of lament. When that Spirit-led lament is happening, as Paul explains in verse 26 and 27, God himself, who understands and sees hearts, will hear that groaning from the dark places of creation's pain. And those who pray that way, even when, precisely when, they don't even know what to pray for, will thereby be formed, shaped into this shadow, this reflection of Jesus. Jesus who is submitting to a cross, Jesus who shared the pain of the world so that the world may be healed and helped. Paul says exactly that in verse 29, and they will therefore be cooperating, not in the work of their own salvation, mind you, but in the larger purpose of God for his bleeding creation. Romans 8:28 is not about how following Jesus means that you should turn that frown upside down because there's a silver lining to every darkness, pain, and struggle which you experience. Nor is it saying that everything in your life will work out or resolve in this age. It is instead an assurance that if you look at the pain of the world and a lament rises up in you, even one you cannot put into words, it means that the Spirit is already working in your heart. It means that you are feeling something that is right and true and in line with God's loving and healing. So it's not a call to demand lament about the wrongs of the world. It's saying that if you look at the broken world and you lament, you are in line with God's heart and his Spirit. That his goodness is working alongside you, synerge, with you, with the pain. That even your lament is something he will bring goodness out of, and that this lament is part of following Jesus in this place. And so a better translation of Romans 8:28 would be, we know, in fact, that God works all things together for good with those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. Looking at the Greek and translating a single word more correctly shifted the meaning of this verse. Next, we turn to 1 Corinthians. Here we have a trigger warning for mention of marital rape. Once again, you can rejoin us if you'd like to skip this part. There is a timestamp in the description below where you can join us again. Okay, 1 Corinthians 7:5a. It begins, do not deny one another. Some translations say, do not deprive one another. The rest of the verse continues, except perhaps by agreement for a set time to devote yourselves to prayer, and then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now here we have instructions written by Paul in his letter to the Corinthian church, and in particular he is addressing married couples. He is talking about sex, having sex within the marriage. This verse has historically been plucked out and pasted into many an argument about how sexual intercourse is owed between marital partners. Men have argued, with the backing of their clergy, that wives owe sex to their husbands as a marital duty, stating, see, even Paul says so. Do not deny one another. Do not deprive one another. So, wife, do not deny me sex. I am owed it according to God's will. This line of thinking has led to everything from husbands who have in overt and covert ways felt justified in pressuring, nagging, or manipulating their wives to have sex with them, to justifying infidelity or the consumption of pornography. I am a man, I have needs, I didn't get it from you, so I went elsewhere to fulfill those needs, to a justification for marital rape. I have a right to your body. We are one. I was just taking what I was owed. Everything about this interpretation is anti-consent. It feeds into rape culture. And it is therefore also anti-free will. And that couldn't be further from the will of God. It depicts sex as it being a human right or a need, and this verse is used as a biblical evidence for that spouses may not deny each other sex whenever their partner desires it. Now, let's have a closer look at the real meaning of this text. For that, we turn to the context in which this letter was written. As we said, Paul wrote this letter to the Corinthian church of believers. This community was located 80 kilometers northwest of Athens in Greece. Corinth, we can see here on the map, was a coastal city, and naturally this Greek metropolis was heavily steeped in history and culture of the Hellenistic philosophy. That was the cultural context of this region. One branch of Greek philosophy, which was particularly prevalent and influential among the Corinthians, was called Gnosticism. Gnosticism taught that reality exists in two planes. One is the lower material world, the world of matter, and above that is the world of thoughts, ideas, concepts, the immaterial spiritual world, if you will. The lower material world was seen as corrupt, base, and our purpose is to escape it into the higher world of thoughts and matterless, bodiless, spiritual existence. What were some of the implications of this? Well, it meant that things of matter were inherently bad and ought not to be considered or valued, and this included the human body and the functions of the human body. What had happened in Corinth was that some of the new believers had combined the teachings of Gnosticism with their new Christian faith. They believed in Jesus, but practiced Gnosticism as well. They taught other Christians that denying their body's needs or distracting oneself from everything in the material world was the path to greater enlightenment and a higher truth and spirituality. And so, many of these Christian converts were deciding that this means sex is bad. Sex is inherently evil and base and corrupt. Married couples were no longer having sex because everything to do with the body and the material world is bad. They thought that abstaining from sex made them more holy, pure, or enlightened. This is what Paul was responding to. He is not talking about abolishing consent. He is not talking about that sex is a human right or that one owes sex to one's marital partner. He is specifically speaking to the Gnostic practitioners in the faith community, saying, do not deny each other. In your marriages, do not withhold sex, thinking that this is the path to enlightenment, purity, or salvation. It is not. He goes on to say in verse 8, to the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain unmarried as I am. So Paul is not saying everyone must be having sex, nor is he, as some believers have, elevated sex to the other extreme of being some sort of path to getting closer to God. There is here a clear picture of this choice is up to you. You can remain unmarried, you can remain celibate like me, but God is a God who created a material world. In Genesis 1, he made a world of matter, made our bodies, created sex, and at the end of it, he declares that it is all very good. Gnosticism would go on to be a major problem and a heretical movement in the 2nd century Christian church. And here we have just one local example of where this unbiblical anti-material teaching had taken root in a particular community. Paul is calling it out and saying, this is not the way to salvation. Here we have a verse which has added to the oppression of women and sexual violence, but which was in fact meant to honor sex and the union of bodies in safe, committed relationship built on mutual trust and absolute respect. An honoring of sexuality, not an obliteration of it, nor a justification for its abuse. The last and final text study we'll be looking at together is found in Luke 21, verses 1 to 4. And after this, we shall have our conclusion to this course. Luke 21. He looked up and saw rich people putting their gifts into the treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. He said, truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them, for all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in all she had to live on. Many of us may have heard this story of the widow and her 2 coins. Every time I've heard it preached, the application has always been the same. This woman gave all she had to God, and so we should give all we have to God. It has been proof texted with other verses like, "Give and it shall come back to you." This idea of giving everything you have to God and you'll be blessed, or God wants everything from you. Surrender all. There was a woman in Texas who went to visit her grandparents to see how they were doing. And when she arrived, she noticed that the power in their house was turned off. There was no electricity. And she also saw that there was very little food in their home. This puzzled her because they had always been careful to budget and could comfortably live off their pension. Something didn't add up. So she asked her grandparents what happened, and they replied, "Our church told us that we all need to increase our giving." The woman felt shocked by this. "So you've given them so much that you can't pay for food or electricity?" "Yes," said her grandparents. "Our pastor said that giving everything we have to God makes us just like the widow who was praised by Jesus in the temple for giving her last 2 coins." Now, I was taught that God wants all of us to give everything we have, just like the widow in Luke 21. I've seen friends lack basic daily needs like food, money for rent, hygiene products, because they believed that too and gave everything to God or to the church. There is more than one elderly couple out there without electricity or food because they believe this is the will of God. Surrender all, give all you own. But does this reality coincide with the Jesus who came to help the poor, who defended the marginalized? How can a God who loves and defends the poor be asking for something that results in more poverty, in more marginalization, in more need and more struggle? Well, let's return to the text and apply our golden rule: context. The scene of Luke 21 is set in the Jerusalem temple. It begins with describing Jesus watching people putting gifts into the temple treasury, a bit like the offering basket of the temple. Verse 1 says, "He looked up and saw rich people putting their gifts into the treasury. And then he also saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. He said, 'Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them, for all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in all she had to live on.'" But what comes directly before these verses? What is the contextual context of the beginning of Luke 21? If you have your Bibles open or you're looking it up online, please turn one page back to the end of Luke 20, the previous chapter. Luke 20 ends on this, from verse 45. "In the hearing of all the people, he said to the disciples, 'Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes, and who love respectful greetings in the marketplaces, and the best seats in the synagogues, and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation.' And right after he said this, he looked up and saw rich people putting their gifts into the treasury, and also saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. The rich were putting in money out of their wealth. This widow was giving out of her poverty. The typical interpretation is that we should be like the widow, not like the rich people. The rich people just give a little bit. They make a show. She doesn't do it for a show. She does it with dignity, not to have others look at her. But there's a bit of a problem with this interpretation. It is nowhere in the text at all. It doesn't say, "The widow gave all she had. You should go and give all you have too." That's one of Jesus' favorite phrases. He sees something good and he says, "Go therefore and do likewise." But he doesn't say that here. Jesus doesn't bring attention to the widow for the sake of pointing out an example for his disciples to follow. Jesus describes the widow's gift without commentary and then abruptly starts talking about something else in verse 5. So why does Jesus mention it at all? Because, as the context reveals, Luke 21, 1-4 aren't the beginning of a section, they are the end of a section. The beginning of the section is what we read earlier, end of Luke 20. Luke 21 is a direct continuation and conclusion to what Jesus was saying in Luke 20, where Jesus is doing some teaching in the temple court. So let's read it again like one block, the way it's meant to be read. From verse 45, in the hearing of all the people, he said to the disciples, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and who love respectful greetings in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." Then as Jesus looked up, he saw rich people putting their gifts into the treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. He said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in all she had to live on." Jesus warned the people around him about the corrupt religious leaders who care more about their power and wealth than the lives of the marginalized people among them. This lesson which he's giving is a criticism against any religious system of thought or monetary giving which manipulates vulnerable members into giving. Any greedy system that masks a message of generosity and surrendering all to God while exploiting them. The scribes, those who are experts at scripture, are described as devouring widows' houses. Jesus is condemning their exploitation and says those who prop up these practices will be punished severely. Quite a different message coming out of Luke 21 when we read it in its proper context. That was our last text study together, but I hope it won't be the last text study or exegesis you go away and experience. Before we part ways and wrap up this course, I'd like to leave us with 3 concluding thoughts, 3 points that address accessibility, responsibility, and continuity. And they all rhyme, so you know it's going to be good. Charles Spurgeon was an English pastor and preacher in the 1800s. He was passionate about the poor of Victorian London. He built an almshouse and orphanage there and encouraged his congregation to actively engage with the marginalized in London. He has a famous quote which goes, "Defend the Bible, I would as soon defend a lion. Unchain it, and it will defend itself." Now, this quote has often been co-opted by people who defend using scripture to attack others and apply spiritual abuse in the name of just speaking the truth. But let us consider this idea as it was meant to be understood in the light of accessibility. Even in a time where information has perhaps never been so easily and readily available to us, Bible illiteracy is a widespread and disastrous reality. The Bible is quoted left, right, and center, online by politicians on bumper stickers, but Bible literacy, as not only history has taught us, but religious leaders of Jesus' day taught us, is not only knowing the words by heart. Bible literacy is also rooted in methodology, in having the right tools to understand what you're reading. You can have all the ingredients for a cake in front of you on the kitchen counter, but if you don't know how those separate ingredients work together, fit together, then you're going to end up with an undigestible mess that might make you and your guests sick. The right recipe, the right tools are needed, But these tools should not be kept for the few or withheld in any way from someone who wishes to learn to use them. At the beginning of our course in our introduction, we talked about this gap that exists between the scholar and the layperson, between the academic arrogance and disconnectedness of one and the just open the Bible and do as it says, no need for fancy interpretation of the other. Neither extreme is where we need to be. Informed, responsible Bible reading tools need to be freely available to anyone who wants to use them. And they shouldn't have to pay years of university fees and years of their full-time life to access them. If you have any doubt about that the Bible was meant to be readily and easily accessible, consider the very language it was written in. The New Testament was written in Koine Greek, not Hebrew, so that only the Jewish scribes could easily read it, nor in classical Greek, the language of Greek philosophy and literature. Koine means common in Greek. Koine Greek was street Greek. It was a slang version of classical Greek used for trading, a simplified shared language of the region. Even the language in which the story of Jesus is told emphasizes approachability and contextualizing. Make it approachable to everyday people and adapting it to their context. Meeting people with the story of Jesus where they are. Truly, this is a strong argument against academic elitism. The Bible can be chained up in more than one way. We may not live in a time and place where we have a large Bible chained up in our church, only there to be read from by the priest once a week, but sometimes this book is chained up in other ways, perhaps behind a paywall, behind a wall of ableism, classism, title, privilege, or with distancing and exclusion which comes with academic superiority and elitism. That is the purpose of this course. That is the point of what we do here at Zeteo School, and I hope that this is the purpose and passion which these classes instill in you, a fire to make this liberating, empowering teaching available to anyone who wants to learn. The point of this class is not for you to have yet another authoritarian voice telling you what the Bible is saying or isn't saying. Nor is it for you to go out with a sense of superiority, to lord power or control over other people, but to be yourself empowered and inspired with tools that you can use for the rest of your life as you read the Bible. Tools that are determined by the Bible itself, a methodology which was practiced by Jesus and Paul, Isaiah and David. Learning the tools of exegesis, contextual reading, and covenant theology should be made accessible to anyone who wants them, whether they can afford the time and cost of attending university full-time or not. The second concluding thought I'd like to leave with you concerns responsibility. There is a 2010 movie called The Book of Eli. Denzel Washington plays Eli, the main character, who is traveling through a barren post-nuclear war-torn North America. With him, he carries a book. His goal is to deliver his copy of this mysterious book to a safe location on the West Coast where it might be preserved and protected. However, as he travels, he passes through a town which is run by a tyrannical warlord called Carnegie, and what Carnegie cares most about is power, controlling people and maintaining power in this lawless time. While Eli is in town, Carnegie discovers that the book which Eli carries is a Bible, and most books, including Bibles, were all destroyed during the war. Now, Carnegie isn't a believer. He's not a religious man, but he says he must have that book, saying, "I grew up with that book. I know its power." In this world, most people are either unable to read, as education and written word is very rare to come by, or they were blinded during the nuclear war. Carnegie is one of the few people in town who knows how to read, and this is one of the reasons he gained and has maintained power. Now, he sees unlimited potential if he has in his possession a Bible. Before the war, he experienced how this book could sway masses, what great power it had. And if he is one of the few who can read, that means he can say that the Bible says anything he wants it to say, and people will follow his will. One of his henchmen asks why Carnegie is willing to go through so much fuss to get his hands on this Bible, and Carnegie responds, I'll leave out the expletives, it's not a book, it's a weapon. A weapon aimed right at the hearts and minds of the weak and the desperate. It will give us control of them. If we want to rule more than one small town, we have to have it. People will come from all over. They'll do exactly what I tell them if the words are from the book. It happened before, and it'll happen again. All we need is that book. Now, I don't necessarily recommend this movie. It is heavily violent for one, but the story does a great job at demonstrating something which has been happening throughout human history. The Bible is seen by different people in different ways. To some, it is a weapon to control others, a weapon for those who seek power. For others, it is a liberating tool for those who genuinely seek truth, justice, and freedom. But like all tools and weapons, like anything that can be powerful or impactful, we are faced with the choice of how to use it, how to wield it, how we handle it. I hope that we have adequately proven in this class how misuse of this book has had massive real-life impact on the world. Using this text irresponsibly, whether deliberately or not, has upheld patriarchal oppression, justified the abuse of children, bolstered the rule of tyrants, justified slavery, classism, racism, murder, Nazism, xenophobia, misogyny. Even today, as we go through this class, I watch as people I know, people who have grown up in the church, who have read the Bible all their lives, are justifying and rationalizing a genocide. The genocide of the Palestinian people, which is happening right now by using this book. As we approach the Bible, we must be aware and take ownership of the responsibility which comes with it. As we said at the beginning, to make a vow similar to the Hippocratic oath which doctors take before entering their profession, to do no harm. So we must also commit ourselves to responsible methodology and practice when interpreting this text. 2, to the best of our ability, do no harm. The oppressor has always sought to wield the Bible for harm, whether it is the power-drunk pastor, the racist grandmother, the narcissistic Sabbath school teacher, the slave owner, the warmonger, the hateful, greedy, the reinforcers of patriarchy, the rich, the bully, the spiritual abuser. What we have learned in this course also presents each of us with the personal challenge of responsibility. Teach the Bible responsibly. We help to guard against misuse or irresponsible Bible reading by learning and applying responsible tools. Please exegete. Read contextually. Study with humility. Unlearn habits and teachings which should be unlearned, and learn better practices. Because you and I are responsible for how we use and wield this book, and it will impact real lives. And the last and final point concerns continuity. In Hebrews 4, the author describes the Word of God as being living and active. The New Testament, in particular the book of Acts, is left in a sort of unfinished, open-ended sort of way. You read the story of Jesus, then you read how believers in Jesus have community and live together, and then there's sort of an unfinished air to it. It doesn't really end. And there's a reason for that, because the story isn't ended. It isn't over. We are still living the story. We are part of the continued story of God and his mission to help humanity and heal creation. And this should tell us something about how we should view the Bible as well. If it is indeed God-inspired, given through divine revelation and spirit-breathed, then we are also going to find that the text moves and grows with us as we move and grow. Not that the Bible is changing, but rather as we study it, we will change and move and grow. Often when we talk about the Bible, we speak in terms which describe something dead, dormant, stagnant. This mindset is reflected in our language. We say the Bible must be preserved, protected, defended. But perhaps the engaging journey it invites us on, the lifelong journey it invites us into, should be phrased more as the Bible must be explored, experienced, revisited. Because if we have a relationship with a living God, we will grow and move. That can sound scary for some because change is often associated with heresy or novelty abandoning old truth. But perhaps it's actually discovering old truth for the first time and it being allowed to swell and grow into our everyday lives and context. Paul had to move from viewing believers in Jesus as a Jewish cult that posed a threat of heresy to discovering that Jesus was the very Messiah he'd been waiting for all his life. Paul had to do a complete U-turn. Peter had to grow. He had to be taught through elaborate demonstration that Gentiles were just as much children of God and part of God's kingdom as Jews. And he still fell back into old habits of thinking and had to be reminded and corrected repeatedly. Consider these two huge names in Bible history, Peter and Paul. If they had to dramatically move and grow as they journeyed with Jesus, what makes us think we're exempt from needing growth and movement too? What makes you and I so arrogantly assume that we don't have anything new to learn or anything we need to unlearn? That our entire theology is not only perfect, but there's nothing that needs to be added to it, nothing that needs revision or even a dramatic overhaul by the same Jesus who spoke to Peter and Paul. If these two people, and David and Abraham, if Mary, mother of Jesus, and Miriam and Martha had to be corrected and taught, developed and changed, what makes us think we don't? The very nature of the narrative of the Bible is that it is an ongoing story, that it invites you to be a part of it. We can use this metaphor. It is a God-breathed document that will grow with you as you grow with Jesus. I have myself experienced that. No matter how many times I've looked over the same text before in my life and past years, reading it again is like coming to a new landscape and seeing things I've never seen before. This is the invitation of the Bible. Not stagnation, not entrenchment, not blind and anxious defense of tradition. It is a lion that we needn't defend or prop up, but calls us to responsible use. That is why we chose this logo for this course, the one you've been seeing over the past week, a tree growing out of the Bible, to depict something alive, moving and growing. To exegete and being a part of the biblical story is an ongoing, adventurous, intelligent, authentic, enthralling journey that invites us back again and again to experiencing the beauty and the compassion of a person at the center of that story. You could spend a lifetime traveling through this book and you'd never reach the end of what it has to reveal and teach you. Thus, it invites us to continuity. And on that note, we end our final class and our course together, with the hope that each of you will continue to use the tools learned here. I sincerely hope that our journey has been enlightening and useful. A huge thank you to Ida for being our co-host over on our Zoom Live for the week where we were teaching this course. She has been an invaluable support to the team in our work here at Zeteo, following the long process of putting this all together. A big thank you also to Derek Simon for his support in this project and research work. And finally, thank you to our patrons who support us over on our Patreon. Your donations help us to keep doing what we're doing. If you believe in the work we're doing here at Zeteo, you can also become a patron, or you can make a one-time donation via our PayPal. The details are now on the screen. But either way, our courses will always remain free at Zeteo, and we are determined to reject paywalls. You are also very welcome to visit us at our online house church called The House. You'll find The House on YouTube. There we have a bunch of exciting Bible stories which you can watch. Thank you all so much for joining us for this course, How to Read the Bible. May God inspire you all. Bye for now.